So hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy Friday. Happy Earth Day. I'm Bayley Mizelle, the Director of Photographic Arts Council, Los Angeles. We're so happy to have you here joining us today, and we are joined by artist Phil Chang. Thank you for joining us today, Phil.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, I'd like to send a note of gratitude to our board of directors, membership, and sponsors. Thank you for your ongoing support and commitment to PAC LA's growth, our programming, and building our community, making events like today possible for artists and our photographic community of Los Angeles and abroad. Just a quick run of show for today. Phil will present to us for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then following his presentation, I'll return to moderate our Q&A and open conversation. During the conversation, at any point, please add your questions and comments to the chat and Q&A boxes. And Phil and I will get to them as we can, and of course, during our conversation at the end. Just a quick intro on Phil. I'll read half of his bio, and then I'll include the rest in the chat with a link, some other links that you can enjoy. Phil Chang received his MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and his BA from the University of California, Irvine. Recent solo exhibitions include the Suburban in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Cash Active at LAXART, and recent institutional group shows include Light Play Experiments in Photography, 1970 to the Present, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Keeper of the Hearth, picturing Roland Barthes' unseen photograph, Houston Center for Photography, A Matter of Memory, Photography as Object in the Digital Age at the George Eastman Museum, Rochester, New York, About Time at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and Unfixed, the Fugitive Image at the Cleveland Museum of Art's Transformer Station. Again, everyone, I'm going to pass it over to Phil now, but please feel free to add your questions and comments in the chat, and I will be monitoring them. And I'll pass it to you, Phil.
Great, thank you, Bayley. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's a real honor. I've known of PAC for many, many years, and it's really an honor to be able to speak to you guys about the work. And also, I just want to say it's always a nice privilege to just speak about one's work right now during this pandemic, during all these adjacent related crises that we're all experiencing. So thank you for that opportunity too. Bayley, should I start sharing right now? Would that make the most sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Excellent. So everyone, I wanted to share with you two bodies of work. One is very, very recent body of work that just shown in LA at M&B Gallery that just closed April 2nd. I was going to start with that. And then another new body of work that I had started many, many years ago, but I've kind of reinvigorated it during the pandemic. So you could expect two different bodies of work. So I wanted to start everyone with slides related to this most recent exhibition that I just closed called Pigment and Canvas. Again, this was at M&B Gallery here in Los Angeles. This reflects a lot of my current interests, and I thought maybe I would start by just sharing some of my motivations and just to kind of give you some background with the kind of how I'm approaching photography and art, and hopefully that would then make sense with the images of the works that I show you. I do have a very deep interest and intimacy and commitment to the medium of photography. That commitment happens based on a deep interest in like how useful photographs are and how useful photography is, but also a deep commitment to the conditions and problems I think that are associated with photography as a medium. And so I'm bringing up this kind of contradictory relationship to the medium because it's helped me understand that though I think we could all agree in this talk that photography is really good at describing the world and the images that it produces of the world. In my years of working with the medium, I've discovered something else that's more reflective of the world. And for me, that is, it's how we produce photographs, how we circulate photographs, and how we consume photographs. Those activities, for me, are more indicative, more reflective of the world than actual photographs. So if I just maybe wanted to ask if you could keep that kind of sentiment or that stance in mind, that stance of production, circulation, consumption really informs how I try to use photographic materials. So I wanted to show you this first body of work because a lot of my work is trying to engage and answer a certain question. And that question is, what do I have to do to my materials and my production method so that my artworks or my photographs can only function in contemporary art or as contemporary art? And that's another way to say, what can I do to my work so that it does not get included or it does not function and the other activities, the other categories or genres of photography. And I'm sure we all know that photography is so ubiquitous, it's so widely used, it's so efficient and useful. It also doesn't have to be art. So I'm trying to figure out what can I do to it so it can only function as art. So I did want to start with some slides from this exhibition. And I'm going to start with just images of the products and materials that I have used for this exhibition. This is an image of bottled third-party inkjet printer ink manufactured by Vermont Photo Inkjet. So this is a product designed for users of inkjet printers and photographic materials to bypass some of the more dominant inkjet companies or printer companies. That would be Epson, Canon, Hewlett-Packard, and to save money, so to speak, and to kind of supply their own ink cartridges themselves instead of buying ink cartridges directly from Epson, Canon, Hewlett-Packard. I'm sure many of you probably know that some of these companies, their profit revenue is based on inkjet cartridge sales and less so on printers. And so I discovered this product and I realized I wanted to use this product and collide it with products that are produced from these more dominant manufacturers. Again, Epson, Canon, Hewlett-Packard. So this is just a kind of a product image of inkjet canvas that I've been using. For those who maybe don't know, inkjet canvas is designed to be sent through an inkjet printer where a digital file is then reproduced on the canvas, typically a photograph. And once that's printed, that canvas can be stretched. And now that canvas looks like a painting, even though it started out as a digital file or like maybe a photographic file. I've also used products by another company, Canson. This is just an example of their kind of rolled inkjet printer canvas. And then the process of making the work is incredibly unsophisticated. It's incredibly not technical in any way. I use foam sponges or floor mops to basically soak those mops, and then I manually apply it and different kind of strokes to either inkjet paper and inkjet canvas. This is an early kind of documentation studio view from 2013, where at that point I was using black and white darkroom processing trays, which you can see here. Those types of trays have a gutter in them, and I can pour the third-party bottled inkjet printer ink into it, dip the foam or dip the mop, and then make the mark. In this case, it was inkjet paper. And now these are just installed views and documentation of the exhibition that happened at M&B. This was called, again, Pictures, Pigment and Canvas. I, in 2020, made a very big, significant step as an artist, and I moved from inkjet paper to inkjet canvas. But I think it was probably the most logical step in terms of materials. I have never been trained in painting. In fact, I've never painted before. I never expected to make works that resemble painting, or you could say even masquerade as painting, but I discovered a new way to work. And I discovered also a new way to kind of engage in these materials that I'm very interested in working with, but I had to figure out a relationship to them in terms of production. So what you're seeing here are one of 3 presentation methods that I tried to employ in the exhibition. These are now stretched inkjet canvases around stretcher bars. And now here you see a second presentation method that was in the exhibition. On the left here is quasi monochrome that I tried to make manually, mounted to die bond and then framed with brushed aluminum. And on the right is the third presentation method that I tried to employ in the exhibition. That was adhering the inkjet canvases raw, unfinished, and directly onto the walls of the gallery. This is just giving you another view. And this is another example of one of the larger unstretched inkjet canvases, but adhered to the wall of the gallery. I was going to show you guys quickly some detail shots of this. What I used was industrial double-sided tape manufactured by a company called Gorilla. And it allowed me to experiment with how to adhere these canvases directly to the wall, but I didn't adhere them fully flush. I tried to do certain moments where the canvases would be peeling away, where there would be a sense of precarity, but also a sense of direct contact with these materials. I'm very interested in opportunities where I can transport works that were made in the studio that I was used to seeing in the studio and just put them directly in the exhibition space as if they were still in the studio. So these are examples of that opportunity for me, where I've adhered this canvas here on the left. It's in different sections where it's just partly falling off the wall and partly adhered to the wall. And I just wanted to show everyone some detail shots with titles. Typically with my inkjet printer works, I always follow the same titling kind of format, and that is replacement ink for Epson printers, which kind of refers to the third-party nature of these products. And then in parentheses, the color of the inks that I'm using. And then the last phrase would be on manufacturer's products, basically, in this case, Epson Exhibition Canvas Mat. And here's a view of it installed. And this is one of the stretched inkjet canvases. Here's just another detail view. Replacement ink for Epson printers, photo black on Epson Exhibition Canvas Mat. And this is also installed in the gallery. And here's another view. This is photo black, cyan, and vivid magenta. I did want to maybe point out quickly, when you see these kind of marks that look like blobs or circular marks, those are moments where I pin the canvas to the wall of my studio, which is the drywall, and then I make the marks, basically. I never thought to stretch them because I've never painted before. I just didn't know that opportunity in a kind of ridiculous way. So what you're seeing there are marks where the drywall, uneven texture, is making a rubbing or frottage onto the canvas as I'm applying the ink manually. And here's just the install view. And here's just another detail shot. This is vivid magenta. And in terms of the colors, I'm just borrowing the exact colors that these manufacturers use. So I'm not naming these colors. They usually use vivid magenta in this case, or light vivid magenta. There, you noticed photo black earlier. You might see vivid cyan at some point too, or light cyan. And here's just the install view. And this again was one of the presentation methods where I mounted the inkjet canvas to dye bond and then had it framed around brushed aluminum. This is just another install view of this other kind of process I was trying to experiment with, where you see these horizontal marks that I've made. And at the beginning or the left-hand side of the mark, I've tried to press and just expunge the ink from foam, and that's what's causing these drips to form here. And another thing I was able to experiment with this exhibition was, when I'm in my studio, which is quite small for the size of work that I'm making, I have about a 300 square foot studio, I attach white artist tape tabs to each canvas at the bottom, because typically these works are stacked and then rolled up. These canvases raw are typically 50 by 72 inches. And so for me to identify which canvas is what, I make these marks on these, basically making process notes on the tape with basically a kind of color-coded system. In this case, what you're seeing here is C, cyan, VM, vivid magenta, Y for yellow, LVM is light vivid magenta, and LC is light cyan. And then I've also included a check mark with the word varnish, meaning that indicates that I've applied a varnish to the surface of the canvas to protect it from light and to make sure it is protected from scratches or dings. I was able to include this in the exhibition with the support of the gallery. I've never done this before in my previous exhibitions, but I wanted to just show aspects of production. I wanted to, again, show how would this work look in my studio and how it could also look the same exact way during an exhibition. And then I was able to, because some of these canvases are not stretched, you do see the kind of pinhole marks or pinhole kind of, or the pinholes themselves of what's necessary for me to keep these on the wall when I'm making them through use of push pins. Another thing that appears on some of these raw canvases are Sharpie marker marks, where the inkjet canvas comes off a roll, basically. The rolls that I use are typically either 50 or 64 inches wide. And so I have to pull a certain kind of dimension away from the roll, and I make marks with a straight edge with a Sharpie marker, and I then have those marks to indicate where and when to cut they're rolled on. Some of those, sometimes the marks I miss. And so I decided just to leave those in during the exhibition. So that kind of constituted the more raw presentation, or the kind of unstretched, adhered canvases directly to the wall of the gallery. And here's just another kind of administrative process note on white artist tape. PK refers to photo black. And this is now not an image of my artwork, but just kind of a behind the scenes view of the kind of products and tools I use for the kind of installation and some of the production of these inkjet works. The package in orange shows you the kind of double-sided tape that I've been using. And just, again, another view of tape. I use a lot of tape in my work, actually. This is just another example of one of the unstretched raw canvases that was in the exhibition. And another example of unstretched raw, but also more Sharpie marker marks. One thing I wanted to share with everyone was I was interested in also experimenting with appealing to the gallery's clients in terms of the amount of choices that they could have if one was interested in acquiring a work. So there were 3 presentation methods available. There was the stretched canvases, which is, I think, maybe the safest, the kind of expected route for a work that looks like a painting, but really is not a painting. There was a second option that would be mounting an inkjet canvas to Dibond and having it framed around brushed aluminum. And then the third would be what you see here, an unstretched canvas that I could adhere to someone's wall or the wall of an institution if they chose that method. One thing that I was thinking, however, was that if someone didn't want to see these marks, especially the Sharpie marker marks, they could easily stretch the canvas around stretcher bars and then hide those marks. Now, this is just kind of showing some of the behind the scenes of me installing these works. The stretched canvases were the easiest to install because they were ready for presentation. The unstretched ones were the most difficult. I have to use a brayer or a roller. So once I get the industrial double-sided tape on the rear of the canvas, I have to position it on the wall of the gallery and then kind of adhere it with the roller. And this is just kind of a close-up of the black and white darkroom processing trays that I use. They're very helpful because they have gutters. I can label each gutter, in this case, cyan, light cyan, vivid magenta, vivid light magenta, and then I know which gutter I can pour the ink into, and then take the sponge, which you see, which is the yellow object here, soak it, and then apply it to either the paper or inkjet canvas. If it's okay, I was going to move on to the second body of work. If there's no questions, I'm happy to answer questions too, either after or right now.
Yeah, Phil, we're good on questions so far, so feel free to hop to the next body.
Okay, great. Thanks. I wanted to show you everyone too now the second body of work, which I call unfixed photographs. And I started working on them again in 2021, but I was going to start with the first iteration, which I first showed in a body of work that I call Cash, Active from 2012. Just to give everyone some background info, I'm really interested in how finance and economics has informed not only all of our lives in some way or another, but also my interest in photography. I believe that photography is a medium that's irrevocably connected to network, to economy, to politics, and also basically to capital and capitalism. I think it's a medium and it's an activity, it's an enterprise and endeavor that is so governed by market changes, industrial changes, technical advancements, economic shortfalls in demand, and then now, of course, digital procedures. In 2008, I think everyone remembers there was a really very, very serious, terrible financial crisis that happened. That crisis was very important for me because I started learning about how the fields and professions of finance we're able to develop new financial instruments. And I should just say, I'm not an economics professor and I'm not a finance expert, but I am someone that's interested in these operations. And I'm talking to you about them because they really inform this body of work that I'm about to show you. I became very interested in the collateralized debt object, or the CDO, a financial instrument that was designed to figure out how to profit off the loss that would happen with mortgages collapsing. And that was really interesting to me, as well as frightening, because it made me realize there was a way to profit off loss, and there was a way to make wagers on that. It inspired me to think, how could I apply that logic to photography? If a mortgage in 2008 was then considered a toxic asset, I wanted to figure out, how could I make a toxic photograph? And the reason I wanted to answer that question is I wanted to figure out, how could photography in a toxic format or in a toxic condition raise questions about how we value not only photographs, but how we value artworks. So what I decided to do was to make photographs on expired photographic paper that would only last for 5 hours. And these are light sensitive gelatin silver photographs. Because the paper is expired, that allowed me to have this durational process to occur. But because light is needed to make this body of work, the light needed to view it also contributed to its exposure or its transformation. And I'll show you guys more details, but this is a studio view of the works covered in a light-safe black plastic. What happens, I have to always control for light to kind of preserve the prints until I can show it to someone, whether it's in the studio or in an exhibition. These are the early first iteration of these unfixed photographs. This is C number 1, and this is from 2011. This was photographed in Montaña de Oro, Central Coast. In the late aughts and early 2010s, I had access to an 8x10-inch camera. I had more access to photographic labs where I could photograph 8x10-inch black and white film, have it processed, and then make contact prints on this paper. The paper itself is 8x10 inches, so I'm limited to that format. The project in its first iteration included a diversity of genre, included portraits, landscapes, still lifes, studio views, and I'm going to say with air quotes, abstraction, but they're more concrete and they're photograms, and I'll show you guys examples of that. In this first iteration, I also went for a very standard, if not kind of classic presentation method. So black wood frame, 8-ply acid-free window mat, and then non-reflective plex on the face. This is an example of the photogram work that was included in this body of work. This is called 3 pieces of wood laid on side and 1 piece of wood balancing on the edge. And this was just me basically laying strips of wood on top of the photographic paper and then making an exposure. So this is a cameraless image. I really appreciate these comments and questions. I'm going to actually show you guys quickly some production shots, and hopefully that'll explain Michael's question. Yeah, Heather's question is really good. Heather, can I take that at the end, if that's okay? This is another example. Great, thank you. This is another example of just kind of photogram work. This is just 8.5 by 11 sheets of photocopy or laser printer paper. So I call this 3 sheets of thin paper. This is an example of a studio view or still life in the studio. This is called Wood Studio. And now this is just showing how I had to have frames that were made with a removable backing so I could replenish prints during an exhibition or during some events, even if it's like showing people in the studio. Again, these prints last only 5 hours when you're viewing them, unless I were to cover them up. So I had to make sure there was some safety, or there's an insurance, so to speak, with the framing mechanisms for the work. These are now kind of installation views of the exhibition. This is my first exhibition of this work. It was at 2012 at LAXART when it was located on La Cienega Boulevard. What you see here now are 21 framed photographs that are unfixed photographs, but on the face of each frame is a light safe black plastic with a reference image, which is a laser printout. So I knew what was underneath each sealed frame so that I could install it. Again, because I needed the light to transport, I need light to install. I had to anticipate all these kind of conditions in order to get the exhibition up. And when the opening began, then myself and some staff from LAXART just removed each plastic sheeting from the face of the frame. And so we documented this at the very beginning of the opening, because within about 5 hours, each of these prints would fade basically or transform to a maroonish monochrome. And one thing I wanted to point out is something that I discovered that was very interesting to me in this was I started out where each distinct picture, each distinct photograph was separate from one another. It was distinct or discernible. There was a representational image. So it starts off heterogeneously, and within 5 hours, everything ends in the same homogeneous outcome, and that is a maroonish monochrome. This just kind of shows you kind of a very rudimentary time lapse, so to speak, of each print kind of transforming or fading to monochrome. This now is just documentation to the type of photographic paper I use. I discovered this product by Kodak called Kodabrome 2RC paper. I discovered this in 2006. They ceased production of it in 1993. And I hope this answers Michael's question about the 8-hour process. This paper has a rapid developer built into the emulsion. And I tried using the paper in the black and white darkroom, subjecting the paper to chemistry, including developer stop and fix, and discovered that it wouldn't react well because the silver halide is so desensitized, because it is obsolete and it was last produced in 1993, that I had to cease making it in the darkroom. What I've been doing now, starting back in 2021, was I've now been shooting digitally because I don't have access to an 8x10-inch large format camera. I have my digital file, and then I make inkjet negatives on this product here. This is a product listing from Freestyle Photographic. This is OHP transparency film. And because I discovered also, not only does the processing in the black and white darkroom not work, using the black and white enlarger in the darkroom does not work either for me. And that has to do with the height of the darkroom enlarger bulb and then the power of that bulb. Through many, many tests, I discovered that the most efficient and actual way to make my prints with this process was using a desk lamp. This is what you see here is a desk lamp stacked on top of books. And then there is a number 5 contrast filter taped to the face of the lamp or the head of the lamp. And I was just using a normal kind of household LED bulb. This allows me to get much closer to the print. I'm sorry, the print and the negative, but what you see here now is a stack or a sandwich of anti-Newton ring glass is on the top. Then you have the inkjet negative is in second place, and below that is a photographic paper sandwich. So the A&R anti-Newton ring glass helps me avoid the kind of concentric circles that might appear when making a contact print. And this just kind of shows you now, I do have to make test strips. So I have to figure out the right exposure for these, for this process. And typically for making these unfixed prints, it takes about 60 to 90 minutes to make an exposure. And this just shows you an example of the kind of test strips that I have to make in order to arrive at the final exposure. And now here now is the most recent iteration of the unfixed work. I started making this in 2021. I decided to do this again because I realized the world was in peril. The world has been in peril, but I think the pandemic really exacerbated and made me really profoundly confront that. And I asked myself, if the world's in peril, what is the most risky work I could do? It didn't make sense for me just to make static photographs. It made sense to me, again, to come back to maybe this word that I'm using a lot, these toxic photographs. In terms of the different types of works I made, I realized this type of work, this unfixed these unfixed photographs were the most risky ones for me. So this is called Marine texting. Marine is this person's name. I'm now using a different frame. I'm using metal brushed aluminum frames, also with an 8-ply window mat. The frame is a little bit bigger than the first iteration, but I wanted to kind of change up the presentation because these frames are more modular and they come apart very easily. And I've enjoyed finding out about these frames. And so this is my new kind of process with this body of work. And like the previous iteration, there's a diversity of photographic genre in this body of work. This is called street. And unlike having photograms or abstraction in the first iteration, this new iteration has this approach where I'm doing what's called screenshot compositions. This is called number 1. And I'll show everyone the original image. What I started doing during the second wave of COVID, I started documenting through screenshots my computer and online behavior. And so what you see here is a screenshot of me trying to find a Wolfgang Tillmans photograph from 2017, which is a photograph from a protest around the murder of Mike Brown in 2017. I couldn't find a high enough resolution image. Sometimes in this unfixed body of work, everyone, I do appropriate other people's images as a way to give credit or show homage, but also knowing that if they're all going to fade to monochrome, I think I'm able to sidestep intellectual property violation or copyright infringement. So what you see here now is me trying to find different iterations of this Wolfgang Tillmans image. It appeared on Artforum, the magazine. It also appears as a JPEG here. And then there's a website behind it, as well as a Photoshop menu. There are moments or instances of the kind of sharing gig economy, in this case of bird scooter. And then there's landscapes also included. In this case, these are landscapes from Echo Park in Silver Lake. This is another screenshot composition. This is number 2. And just for the interest of legibility, I'll show everyone the kind of original. This is showing me, showing my looking for the book by Hannah Arendt, and I'm at Amazon's website, and I'm at Skylight Books, the independent bookstore in Los Feliz. Below that is the nonprofit journalist website Politico, and it's right after the January 6th siege on the Capitol building. And one thing to point out, my monitor that I use is horizontal, like most monitors, so I'm selecting a screenshot that will fit the dimensions of an 8x10-inch sheet of paper. So that's why you see this kind of maybe more vertical framing that's happening. This is an appropriated image from a stock image. I'm calling this cleaning number 1. I don't usually include myself so much in my work, nor family members, but I was thinking if the world's in peril, I might as well include a photograph of my son at age 2. So this is called Child. And I've also been trying to experiment with the use of vector graphics, as well as trying to engage with some of the more dominant corporations that we all have some relationship to. Instead of me photographing, let's say, an Amazon fulfillment center in San Bernardino, I decided to start downloading Amazon's logos as vector graphics. And unlike photographic images that are digital, that are bound by certain scale and resolution, vector graphics are not. And that really is helpful for my project because I do need a certain amount of resolution to print out onto that OHP transparency film and then make my contact prints. So I was able to just stretch and distort this Amazon logo to just include the partial A, ZON, and then the kind of ambiguous smile gesture and arrow or a mouse cursor that appears on all the logos. And then more instances of the gig sharing economy, in this case, an Uber, Lyft, and then a Hyundai Ioniq vehicle. I've also just been photographing around Los Angeles. This case, this indicates the Paul Smith store on Melrose in West Hollywood. And then kind of landscape adjacent, this is called tree number 1. In terms of a technical note, if I'm lucky enough to have access to a digital medium format camera, that amount of resolution that that type of device can provide is the most helpful for this project. But I've also used iPhone pictures that hold up a bit, but resolution is important just in order to have this sense of legibility and clarity in the very beginning as during the presentation of this work, knowing that everything will fade eventually to monochrome. I've also been photographing Prius wheels throughout the years, and so this is just one example of them. This is tree number 2. This is a friend of mine who was helping me agitate the inkjet printer ink that I showed you guys in the previous slides. And this is the last screenshot composition. This is number 3. And then again, for legibility purposes, let me show you guys the original. This just shows myself looking for the historian Timothy Snyder's book online, the book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. One website shows Paula's bookstore in Portland. Another website that's buried here is Amazon's website. There's also a moment of me looking for Epson cartridges, as well as my ink supply levels on my printer. There's a Spotify document or interface below it, as well as some documents on my desktop. I've also been photographing small lot developments around Los Angeles. And this is maybe the examples of maybe architecture or built environments that's included in this body of work. And then I'm calling this glove, artist tape, and arm. I do, if I'm fortunate enough to be able to kind of talk about the studio is a very important space for me. I think photography and every medium within visual art is always subject to certain myths of originality, myths of genius, myths of aura, myths of connoisseurship. And I think the studio as a physical space is always subject to those myths too. And so sometimes I try to like make images or make work that kind of tries to confront those myths. And so the glove, the kind of white cotton glove or artist tape are just everyday simple tools that I hope to maybe kind of challenge some of those myths. This is an example now of what every photograph kind of transforms or exposes to. And this is this maroonish monochrome, what I call exposed monochrome. And then I did want to end with showing just kind of a mock-up, so to speak, or a provisional set of images that serve as an example of a digital art project that I'll be doing next month in May with the artist-run group called Zome, ZOME.art. So similar to the unfixed works that I've been able to show you guys that exist in the real world that actually transform and fade based on the light that you need to view them, I'm trying to transfer that very same logic and process over to the digital space and figure out how can I rapidly accelerate the compression and the degradation of a JPEG image, so of a digital image. I think maybe most of us know that JPEG images are removing, expunging information constantly in order to keep their file size small, so then we can post them online or we can send them through email. And typically the human eye cannot notice that loss. But there is a way to rapidly accelerate that loss. And I have an algorithm that's been developed that basically accelerates this to exaggerate it. And I'm going to just show you now the kind of degradation that happens. Right now, we have about 750 derivative images that show the degradation. I'm showing you every 100th image. And I'm just going to go back to here as another way to explain. This was the original image that was printed out on the OHP negative. Then I made a contact print on the Kodak paper. And then that appeared, and that may be more kind of sepia toned image. But I did want to point out that right now, in this iteration of these unfixed photographs, I do start out with a very clear, if I'm lucky, or high resolution of photograph that's color and digital to begin the process. That's the end of my slides. I can stop sharing or I can bring up some images again, but I'm happy to take questions.
Phil, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
And everyone, thank you for your comments and questions in the chat as we go. It's been great. Thank you so much, Herman, for all the brilliant compliments. Phil, did you want to hop into Heather's question just to get the ball rolling? I have some points here too that I'm thinking about, but Heather did have a good question starting out.
Yeah, that does. Thanks, Heather. I'll read it real quickly. Heather writes, how do you define a toxic asset as in a mortgage as a toxic asset? And what makes artwork a toxic asset? Are you the one who's profiting from loss or from losing? Again, I'm always remiss and hesitant to maybe use certain language in which I'm not part of that profession. So my understanding of a toxic asset would be one that is known to be a liability. And so the mortgage, I understand, was the toxic asset that was connected to a house, let's say, or some property that was underwater at the time, where the mortgage, right, was worth more than the house itself.
Mm.
Okay, so I think what would make an artwork toxic, Heather, for me would be, in case of my work being photographic, one that does not adhere to some of the more standard conventions of photography, permanence, staticness, stability, archival stability, legibility, clarity. In my case, I'm not having anything be stable. My works are very ephemeral and they're really durational in some ways. But, they do start off with a discernible image and they're still left with something, and that is a monochrome. It's just that I think we don't think of the monochrome as being depictive or representational.
Right.
In terms of who profits from the loss, I don't know. I've never shown the unfixed works in a commercial setting. I've only shown them at the level of institutions, nonprofits, and artist-run spaces. So I don't know if there's been much profit other than maybe a cultural or discursive gain for me, at least.
Right. Phil, and then also my personal favorite body of work of yours so far, Cash Active. It also kind of plays into what you're talking about, the ephemerality of your work. It's directly focused on that. And I want to know if you can kind of talk a little bit about the performance of photography, whether it's through the viewership or through its ephemerality.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very interested in that arm of conceptual art called institutional critique. Studying at CalArts, where I got my master's of fine art, I was really introduced to institutional critique from certain former faculty members. And I wanted to figure out how to also participate institutionally through critique. But then I realized that photography is limited in a way, because if I were to photograph the object of my critique, I both enable it, and then I also can disable it in a way. And I realized just depicting it wasn't enough. So I realized if I wanted to photograph the exhibition sites in which I was participating in or I was exhibiting in, that wasn't sufficient for me. So instead I started thinking, what else could happen in the exhibition site that I could use? And I realized it would be the light you needed to view something. And so that's how I think of duration or performance. And that's what then includes the viewer. I need viewers to be part of this work. Yeah, I could make an animated GIF of it and put it online, but it really is a different thing than the work really insists in being in person with it. And the light that the viewer needs to view it, makes it change, contributes to the transformation to monochrome.
Right. That's why the title is just so perfect of that exhibition.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm going to hop to the Q&A really quickly. We have two great questions here. The first is from Alia. Forgive me, Alia, if I say any of your question wrong. Hi, Phil. Your idea of photography being inextricably linked to capitalism is super interesting. When you speak of the toxicity of the unfixed photos, is that derived from their subversion of the market? That is, since they self-destruct, they kind of invert our ideals of how commodified archival objects should operate. Follow up, how has the market responded, or have the collections freaked out in a nicely uncomfortable way? Or have the collectors freaked out in a nicely uncomfortable way?
Thanks, Ali. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right too. I really appreciate those questions too.
Good.
I think you're right. When I speak of toxicity, I could call them harmonious photographs, right? And harmonious photographs maybe would be ones that
Interesting.
that don't have friction. I would say maybe a harmonious photograph would be something that I could upload to Instagram without friction or conflict. So you're right. Toxicity would be because of the subversion of the market, or just the problems it introduces, because many people do not like looking at them, to tell you the truth. They feel guilty, I've discovered. And that's something I just wasn't prepared for. People that have viewed them have told me they feel responsible. They don't feel worthy of looking at it. They feel like they're contributing to the death of something, right, to the demise or the obsolescence of something. So that was interesting to think about. They do self-destruct in a way, but I'm also trying to claim that the discernible image, the representational image fades, but one's still left with something that is a monochrome.
Right.
And then the follow-up question, how has the market responded, or have the collectors freaked out in a nicely uncomfortable way? It's been productive. It definitely has been productive. It's made me realize, I think, that the audience of this work have been, at least in terms of my knowledge, have been mostly artists, writers, and curators. To my knowledge, I don't think a collector has purchased one of these, but again, it has only been institutions. And then it's also shown that institutions and then nonprofits who haven't collected it, and then artist-run spaces who haven't collected it but have shown it.
Nice. Okay. Thank you for those thoughts there, Alia. This is from Douglas Marshall in the Q&A as well, if you want to there. For the replacement ink works, in the exhibition, was there a feeling of pressure to put the works into frames, which signifies complete in the photo world, versus installed directly to the wall?
Yeah, thank you, Douglas. There wasn't a pressure, but there was more an insistence on my part, because I'm not a painter. I respect painting, but I feel, Douglas, that photography bears the burden of a double standard that painting does not have to. And that is precisely because photography doesn't have to be art. I think there's so many applications and there's so many efficient uses of the medium that if it's not going to be art, that's okay. It can still continue. I would argue that painting and sculpture, typically from the default and the onset, are always considered art. So I was trying to be ready and anticipate that I knew my viewers of that exhibition would probably read those works as paintings, but I wanted to do something, Douglas, where it wouldn't just be paintings. So the framing mechanism was one way to kind of help viewers know that, okay, there's another way to think about this work. Even though they look like canvases, they are canvases, they really are designed for reproduction. And what I'm trying to do with that exhibition, everyone, is trying to use materials intended for reproduction, but to use them in a way that only produce a singular outcome. And that was the works on view in that show.
Right. Phil, I'm really enjoying how you are answering these questions. I love how everyone in the chat is engaging these subjects. I'm excited.
Oh, great.
Here's a question from Herman Milligan in the chat here. What does this mean for the collecting of your work? How should the collector approach your work? It's a follow-up to Alia's original question.
I guess, Herman, I would say, even just asking those questions, I'm not sure what your relationship to art and the group is, but the fact that you would ask that, I think that's engaging to me. I'm not a collector, so I don't know what it's like being on that other side, but I am one that really appreciates conversation and discourse. I think there's so many easier ways to lead a life than art, to tell the truth, that if there's not discussion and discourse for me, it's really not worth it. So to even just ask those questions, Herman, that's where I would like to start.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so let me get to Paula. Sorry, these questions, there's more coming in.
No, that's okay, yes.
We're good on time, everyone, so we'll get to them. Paula Ely. What has been the response of collectors and institutions? We're also concerned with long-term archival quality. This really upsets the idea as far as archives and yeah.
Yes, I have never had a collector actually, I think, come to the studio. Well, no, I've had collectors come to the studio, but I don't think I've shown them the unfixed work. The times where I've seen people respond with guilt or shame has been either someone from the commercial side of the art world, and then sometimes people who are not in art. they're not expecting to see a photograph change, especially one that's physical. I think we would use some maybe video or animated GIFs doing that, but I think the stakes with something digital is very different than the stakes of something physical. So Paula, I appreciate that question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't have experience with collectors seeing these as far as I know, at least in my studio, but if there was at a show, an exhibition, and if I wasn't there, maybe some did. The response now, Paula, from institutions, they've never expressed guilt or shame. The only thing they've ever expressed is like, how do we preserve these? And they really, some of the institutions I've worked with, they really loved that challenge. And so I really like collaborating with them to figure something out. And when I've worked with different institutions, what I give them is always different because their needs are different. There's not a series of guidelines and protocols that govern this type of work.
Really great question, Paula, on the archival quality of the work. I have a comment question kind of from Janet Kahn here. She said, I loved your show at MNB. The pieces are quite beautiful. Now listening to you, I see you are a disruptor, asking us to see differently. Is that correct? Would you title yourself as a disruptor and maybe talk about that a little more in depth, the idea of being a disruptor?
Yeah, thanks, Janet, for that. I have not thought of myself as a disruptor, but I will admit and take responsibility for, you might remember how in the beginning of my introduction, I was telling you everyone that I'm trying to figure out how to answer a question that I apply to myself, that I ask, and that is, what can I do to my work so it can only function as contemporary art or in contemporary art? And the reason I want to do that, everyone, is I'm trying to sidestep the ubiquity of photography to go to the multiplicity of art. And that is, in my life, I haven't found something that can do what an artwork does. And that is, an artwork can be many things at once. I think it can be a decor. It can be a site for discourse or philosophical inquiry. It can be a commodity. It could be a financial asset. It could be a speculative asset. It could be a historical artifact. I'm more interested in those conditions than the ubiquity of photography. And so I'm trying to figure out what can I do to my work, Janet, so it can only function within contemporary art. And what I figured out is if I can misuse the materials or if I can improperly follow steps of photography or image production, that would be disruptive, I guess. You could say that's right. I have not thought of the word disruptive. I've just been thinking about misuse or transgression. I've learned this medium and I really respect it. And I use it in a proper way too. But I find that for my artwork, I have to misuse those steps or misuse those rules.
Thanks. Good question there, Janet. I actually want to ask you, how would you situate your work or process in relativity to the theory of visual literacy, but also in the structures of its material? Right?
So in relation to visual literacy?
Yeah, so the theory of visual literacy in relation to its material, how would you kind of situate them in that space, right? As the work is heavily ephemeral, right? And then the concept of visual literacy, which is like the ability to understand how to read representations of culture, right? So how would you kind of situate your practice in that idea? Maybe that's like a larger question or maybe not a large one at all, but.
It's a large one, definitely. I'm processing it. I try to rely on, and you probably noticed that I really wanted to provide everyone with title, medium listing, year, and materials. That written textual language or typewritten language is very important for me because I think every artwork needs a context. And every artwork needs a conversation or language in which is designated as art. And so that is a form of legibility for me that I would hope helps visual literacy, because I don't think photographs alone can do that because they're mute. Most of them are static. Some of mine are not static, but most of them are. They need a context. That context helps determine them. That context also helps us understand what we're looking at, why we're looking at it. Yeah. In terms of, what was the second part of the question, Bayley? Visual literacy and?
Oh, and I mean, you're answering it, the materiality.
Oh, okay.
So
the materiality.
With the disappearance or the,
right.
or the active image, right?
Yeah, I think for that part, I've always thought about appealing to an exaggerated form of guilt or shame, or like a sense of loss that the people have expressed to me. And I would hope that viewers know that I'm really exaggerating it. that it's so exaggerated that what you feel really doesn't matter. And it's nice you feel that. I really appreciate it, but it has no bearing on the work, really, right? I'm just trying to raise questions about value, and it just so happens that it makes some people feel guilty and shameful.
Right.
There's others that feel, I've had some people laugh, and that's great. And I have other people just say, wow, they contemplate or they ruminate. So I don't want everyone to think it's just pure guilt and shame producing. But there's been a range of emotional responses.
Yeah, and relationships to value, right? Which is also how we negotiate what we're kind of engaging. Okay, and then we're getting close towards the end of we're getting at 4 o'clock. But there's one more point that I think you've covered this, but maybe this is a fun space to engage. Herman, who also had noted that he's a collector, he wanted to ask what you're thinking about your work digitally, moving into a digital space, and some ideas behind that.
Yes, thanks, Herman. That's good to know you're a collector. So now that explains your question. I do work digitally. In my everyday life, I'm using my phone, or I have a digital camera, but I just sometimes don't show those digital images. But the unfixed works that I showed everyone, those start digitally, those start computationally. But I found a way to physicalize them in the kind of expired Kodak paper. The inkjet printer works really don't involve digital at all, because I'm intentionally not using the computer. I'm intentionally not using the printer. So I'm just really manually involved in that. That last kind of prototype work I showed you guys, the mock-up of the accelerated compressed JPEG, the degraded JPEGs, that's probably going to be that will be my first digital project. That'll be surely digital. I don't know, Ermin, I've never worked in this space really before, but it's exciting to me because I think my work really tries to engage with questions of the marketplace, as well as, again, questions of value. And I think what's happening around the scarcity around digital goods, precisely because the blockchain, crypto, and NFTs is now creating a new scarcity, a scarcity that I'm used to already in photography. The medium is infinitely reproducible. We have these conventions that we've internalized or that we enact that tries to corral, right, tries to contain its reproducibility, make it scarce. So I'm interested now exploring this in a different way, and that would be the kind of digital NFT space.
Yeah. I like when you use the term accelerated as well, which goes kind of back to cache. The idea of accelerated memory. We have one more question actually that I want to engage from Michael Hawley. It's here in the Q&A. And this could be our last question. Regarding your third bullet point, consumption. When I first saw your vanishing work in 2013, it was that shot you showed of the side view of sideburns of a guy on a chair. It only existed for a short time, but I remember the image super clearly. Is the speedy disappearance your way of saying to us, the consumer, pay attention, life is fleeting?
That's great, Michael, you saw that work. Wow, 2013, so that would have been, just trying to remember, gosh, I have pandemic-induced memory distortion. I'm curious where Michael saw this, but I'd be open. Okay, thank you, Diane Rosenstein. I'd be open to that sentiment or that outcome, like pay attention, life is fleeting, but I wasn't thinking that. I'm open to it, but I also don't want to come off as someone that's dictating, right? That somehow not enough attention is being paid, because that's out of my control, whether it's my work or any media or artworks in general. But what I was thinking definitely in 2013 at that group exhibition that you saw, Michael, was just showing these works and just hopefully having people think about value and think about some of the things that we cherish about photography. And also maybe thinking about one's emotional response to these things kind of transform before your eyes.
Nice. I like the idea that life is fleeting. Thanks, Michael Hawley, for that final thought. And again, everyone, thank you so much for your wonderful engagement of Phil's work and his process, and the comments in the chat. I'm sorry if I missed any. Join us again next time, or maybe we can reach out to Phil again. We'll be talking with him again. I know it. And again, thank you so much, Phil, for today.
Thank you. This is a real honor and pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for having me.